Resident Evil isn't about zombies. It never was. Still, when people talk about Resident Evil, zombies always come to mind. And when people talk about zombies, Resident Evil somehow always shows up. But why is that? The franchise left zombies behind more than a decade ago. In fact, Resident Evil keeps abandoning zombies time and time again. So why are people still calling it a zombie franchise? Well, what if I told you that the most famous zombie franchise in gaming history was misunderstood because of a translation? Okay, central question, guys. Why does Resident Evil keep abandoning zombies? Secondary question, why does that actually make perfect sense? And I know what you're thinking. Isn't Resident Evil a zombie survival horror experience? And the answer is yes. But also no, it's a survival horror game. Yes, the mechanics of the gameplay is proof enough of that. But if you think about it for even a second, the zombies were never the main threat, let alone the focus of the game. Resident Evil was never a zombie franchise. Resident Evil was a bioweapon horror franchise, and zombies were just the early symptoms of that idea. And the biggest reason we forgot that might be the name. Resident Evil has had a branding problem practically since the beginning, and this is not because the series lost its way, though if you wanna get into that lost its way rabbit hole, you can always watch my latest Resident Evil video. This game has had a branding problem because the West was never really told what they were being sold in the first place. You see, in Japan, the game is not called Resident Evil, the game is called Biohazard, and that tiny yet enormous change, that single word, changed everything. Biohazard, okay, I'll say it normally, sorry. Biohazard doesn't mean zombies. It doesn't mean undead. Hell, it doesn't even mean horror. Biohazard is a man-made biological horror, an abomination, an organic weapon. Literally a biological hazard, a biohazard. This is important because since the creation of the game, Resident Evil never wondered what if the dead came back to life, because no, this was not a story with your beloved Romero zombies. The real question was, what happens when humans try to weaponize life itself? And they fail at it. In 1996, Biohazard was released in Japan by Capcom, the first survival horror game. A game centered on illegal experimentation, corporate science, and biological weapons that obviously escape captivity. I mean, come on. Because on Biohazard, you fight many different types of mutations created by the T virus, the biohazard. This is what zombies are, creations of the T virus. So we are just fighting more biohazards. And yes, it just happens that these biohazards are zombies, but that does not mean that every biohazard are zombies. As you can clearly see with the hunters and that giant plant thing on Resident Evil 1. In all of this, zombies were never the headline. They were the evidence. But when the game was brought to the West, there was a teeny problem. Capcom couldn't use the name Biohazard because it was already trademarked, apparently not only by another game, but also a band. So Capcom had to improvise and do it quickly, and that is how we got Resident Evil. The game now sounds like it was made for haunted houses, for ghosts, for curses, for evil that simply exists on a place that we are visiting. And without the correct meaning, this translation reframed the entire franchise for the public. Originally, in Japan, horror rooted itself in science, in experiments, but in the West, it sounded like the horror came more from the mansion itself, like from a curse or something. Until you reach later levels in the game, yes, but by that time, the damage was already done, because a lot of people had already made their minds up about this. Because once zombies enter the public imagination, everything else got buried underneath them, and that misunderstanding stuck. So when Resident Evil started showing us hunters, tyrants, nemesis, parasites, mold networks, and fully engineered bioweapons, people said that the franchise had lost its way, lost its identity. But that identity was never zombies. It was biohazards. And once we see that, Resident Evil's entire evolution makes perfect sense. Because if zombies were never the point, then what was? As we just established, zombies were never the goal of Resident Evil. They were the result, the failure. In the original game, zombies exist for only one reason. The T-virus didn't work as it was supposed to do. The T-virus wasn't created to raise the dead. It was created to enhance living organisms. But when the body is exposed to uncontrolled amounts of the T-virus, we get a zombies. That's why we see zombies shamble around. That's why they attack us, because higher brain function has been destroyed by the virus. So now they're unstable, they're uncontrollable, and they are unpredictable. Military-wise, yes, they can be useful. Chaos is known to weaken the enemy. But what the game understands is that these zombies, they're mostly useless. That's why zombies are everywhere early on. Not because they are important, but because they are disposable. They fill hallways, they slow you down, they remind you that something went incredibly wrong here. But they are only a threat to the inexperienced. The real danger, literally in every game, is always deeper into the facilities, behind locked doors, inside containment units. That's where the actual experiments are. Zombies aren't the monsters of Resident Evil. They're just the symptoms. If zombies are the aftermath, then the bioweapons are the main point. Every iconic Resident Evil creature is built around this. The original Tyrant from Resident Evil 1, unlike the zombies, it wasn't an accident. It was a prototype, a humanoid weapon engineered for combat, intimidation, and durability. Hunters weren't just monsters, they were battlefield units, fast and efficient. Nemesis wasn't created to scare the player. You know what? I do believe that Nemesis was created to scare the player. I do believe that was a factor in mind at the designing table. But lore-wise, Nemesis was created to hunt objectives down autonomously. Nemesis could think. It could adapt. It could way too relentlessly hunt you down. That thing never gave up. Now tell me, in just what movie have you seen that zombie logic? These aren't zombies, this is weapon development. Even as the series evolves, the logic stays the same. Las Plagas isn't a virus, it's controlled through parasites. The mold isn't supernatural, it's just a bio-network capable of learning and remembering. Resident Evil doesn't create creatures for horror alone. They always impose the question, how far can we push biology until it stops obeying us? And they find the answer every single time. They never fail to find that answer. Jesus. Early Resident Evil shows us failure. Abandoned mansions, dead cities, broken labs, mindless infected. Resident Evil 4 doesn't just replace zombies, they replace failed experiments with successful ones, Las Plagas. Resident Evil 5 and 6 push that same idea even further, showing us bioweapons as tools for war. And Resident Evil 7 doesn't go back to zombies, it goes back to biohazards, a contained incident with corporate lies and a biological threat that spreads quietly but deadly. Resident Evil didn't abandon zombies, it outgrew them. And once you see and understand that pattern, the entire franchise stops feeling inconsistent. It starts feeling deliberate. So, if Resident Evil always followed the same idea, why does the misunderstanding still exist? That's because for many people, myself included until I played every single mainline game last year, Resident Evil was not defined by its concept, but it was defined by its first memory. For a lot of players, zombies were their introduction to this game, to this genre. It was their first scare. For me, it was Las Plagas, which I know I already said that those are not zombies, but you get what I mean, okay? Zombies marked their first survival horror experience. And nostalgia? It has a way of freezing things in time. Eventually, zombies became almost a synonym for what Resident Evil felt like, even if they were never what the game was actually about. So when the monsters changed, people felt like the franchise had changed with them. Not because the idea was gone, but because the symbol was. This is why Resident Evil 7 is often described as a return to form. But that phrase is misleading because, as I said previously, Resident Evil didn't return to zombies, it returned to biohazards. Again, we see signs of the early Resident Evil factor. A contained outbreak, corporate negligence, and a biological threat that is hiding behind closed doors. A modern expression of the same question that this series has always asked. How far can biological weapons be pushed until they stop being weapons and they become ecosystems? That is not departure in any sense, it's refinement. Because again, zombies were simply the most visible consequence of early failure. What defines this series is the human ambition colliding with biology, corporations chasing control, weapons that think, life forms that adapt faster than the creators ever imagined. That's why the monsters keep changing. Because the threat isn't dead, or undead for that matter. It's progress without restraint. And once you understand that, you see Resident Evil for what it truly is. A long, uncomfortable thought experiment told through different types of monsters. I think the reason this conversation never really goes away is because zombies are easy to remember, you know, they're iconic, they are simple, and they are what most of us saw first. But Resident Evil was never about the dead coming back to life. It was always about humans going way too far while trying to control life. When you see the series through the lenses of biohazards instead of Resident Evil, suddenly the monster changes make sense. Because with each failure, obviously the experiment gets smarter, the weapons they get more precise, and the consequences naturally get harder to contain. So maybe Resident Evil never really lost its identity, we just learned about it through the wrong name. Let me know if you agree or not down in the comments. Honestly, I'd love to hear how you see the series. Was Resident Evil always about zombies? Did something else define it for you? Or maybe it's still about zombies? Either way, thank you for watching.